Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here today. The last presentations, we've heard a lot of difficult things that we have to think about on euthanizing pigs. I like to start presentations by lightening things up a little bit. So we're going to go with that while I introduce it, and you can enjoy that while I'm talking. So we heard in the last presentations a lot of the kind of acute responses, that the practical level, what do you need to do on the ground once an emergency has happened, and kind of the immediate preparation to do those immediate responses. My presentation is going to focus more on protecting the business as a whole. So it's taking it up a level from that and thinking in advance of the implications that disasters can have on your business. And I like to think of this as a thought exercise that everyone needs to go through ahead of time, thinking through all of these things so that you can plan in advance. One caution that I would say, we don't like dealing with difficult issues. We don't like thinking about bad things that may happen in our lives. I have one of my partners at the law firm does a lot of estate planning. Nobody likes to come into the lawyer and talk about what happens when I die. It's going to happen to all of us, though. Same thing with disasters. They're going to happen, and you need to be prepared in advance for them. But this is not the time for the rose-colored glasses. This is not the time when you're going through this thought exercise to be thinking, it's not going to be so bad. You want to be thinking about the worst-case scenario that's going to happen on all of these, and if you get into it and you've prepared for the worst case, and it doesn't end up being that bad, you're going to be somewhat relieved that you've thought it was going to be worse than it would be, but you're going to be prepared for anything that may come at you. So these are really the steps that I'm going to go through in more detail here of this experiment. The first is identifying what risks are out there. The next two are really focused on how are those risks going to affect my business. How is it going to affect the long-term cash flow and viability of the business? The regulatory reporting is one of those legal acute things that you want to think about in advance. No one wants to think about those at the time. And then the last is getting yourself ready for those. So identifying potential risks is the starting point on this. And when you're doing that, there's kind of really two steps that you want to think about here. For your specific operation, what are the facilities or equipment that may fail in a catastrophic fashion? What within your operation can go wrong? I've identified some that are more common, but every operation, every farm is different, and you want to be thinking about your specific operation. What could break that could cause a significant issue for your operation going forward? The temperature controls, curtain controls, loss of power, those things we've heard some about already. A catastrophic failure of manure storage. We heard some of that with hurricanes in the past. But it goes beyond that. Many systems have their own feed mills. And what happens if you lose that? Going beyond your operation, the next step is also what external events can happen. And on this step, it's important to think about your operation, but it's also important to think about the other businesses that you work with in the flow of your operation. So what if the tornado misses your farm but hits the feed mill that you're using for the feed? What if the fire hits the packing plant like we saw with Tyson in the beef industry? So what if these events happen to other businesses that are going to impact your farm? You need to be brainstorming and thinking about these things in advance so that you can plan for them. Once you've gone through and once you've identified all of those risks that are out there, all those storm clouds that might be on the horizon, you need to step back and say, okay, if those things happen, what am I going to need to do in my operation? How is this going to affect my operation? If you have a fire or a loss of controls, what are you going to do with the dead pigs? What are you going to do with the survivors that you may need to euthanize? Or if you don't need to euthanize, what are you going to do with those survivors to get them cared for properly? Availability of new pigs. Is it going to affect your pig flow going forward? Availability of feed and other supplies that you need. And cleanup. If you have a loss of a facility, you got to get it cleaned up and restored moving forward. So once you've identified your universe of potential risks out there, you need to start thinking about how is this going to impact the business? How is the business going to continue or not continue going forward? And the first step on this that I've identified is look at your obligations in your contracts going forward. And there's two sides to that. One is your inputs. So do you have a contract with a supplier of isoweans if you're not controlling your own pig flow? Do you have a contract with an external supplier of feed or other inputs? Okay. If you do, you want to be looking at those contracts and saying, okay, what am I required to do under this? Am I required to buy these things in specific quantities on an ongoing basis for some time in the future? That's a different implication than if it's a supply contract that just says, if I need feed, I call an order and I pay for that amount of feed. But if I don't need feed, then I'm not on the hook. You need to understand what those liabilities are going to be on the front end to plan for those. Similarly, your marketing contracts on the back end. If you have a contract with a packer that says you will deliver a specified number of pigs each month or each quarter or each year, you need to assess that and understand what that is, as opposed to if you're selling on the cash market and just marketing pigs as they become available. So reviewing all of those contracts is important on the front end. Then you have looking at the contract and assessing it. Does the contract allocate that risk in it? Some contracts will have express terms that say this is happening regardless of any issues that you have. Some will say we're assuming this risk of loss, so if this event happens, you're off the hook, but otherwise you're on. So you really need to dig into those terms of the contract. If you have a contract that allocates risk, and one example of this would be packer contracts. If you have multiple packer contracts where you're delivering, say, 50% of your general supply to one packer, 50% to another packer, what happens if you lose 50% of your supply of market pigs? Some contracts will say you have no liability. Some contracts will say, well, if you lose 50%, then we're taking some of that risk, but you still have to allocate those pigs on a pro rata basis. So you can't completely cut us off while you're delivering all of your pigs to someone else. So read your contracts on that. One particular item with contracts that I'm going to focus on here that's critical in risk management is a force majeure clause. And that's a fancy Latin word that they teach you in law school. But basically what these clauses are provisions in contracts that are intended to deal with the unexpected. And that will excuse one party or the others, or both, obligation to perform if one of these unexpected events occur. Now, I say unexpected events, but when you're drafting the contract, you need to anticipate those, because these force majeure clauses depend on the language of your contract and what events are covered and not. The courts really look carefully at and try to get to a base level sense of what did the parties intend when they formed these contracts? Where did the parties intend that this risk was going to lie? And the extent to which a court is going to excuse performance is going to depend on the language in that contract. So the contract's force majeure clause will generally list a number of events that are called force majeure events. And these lists can be broader or they can be narrower, but you need to pay attention. A lot of times when business folks are dealing with contracts, you're focused on the business terms. What are the price I'm getting for my pigs? How many do I have to deliver? When do I have to deliver them? How are we arranging delivery? Those aspects. Force majeure clause is part of the legal boilerplate that a lot of people gloss over, but it can be important if there's a disaster in the future. So what does the contract specify? These are some of the common ones. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I do want to highlight here the last couple with the concerns about African swine flu and the foreign animal diseases in general. These provisions sometimes specify epidemics and diseases directly. Sometimes they don't. If they don't, that doesn't mean that it's not covered automatically, because based on everything we're hearing about the response, that governmental actions or regulations may come into these clauses and have an important impact on force majeure clauses in this case too. If there's a governmental order that comes in and says pigs are not moving for 72 hours and you were required to deliver pigs during that time period, this is going to be a pretty good defense if you have that provision in the clause. If there's a governmental order that comes in and says you need to depopulate a significant portion of your pig flow, that could be triggered as well. So those are ones in particular with the current situation that you want to be thinking about. One important thing to note, though, is a force majeure clause generally doesn't protect against something that just makes it more expensive to comply with the contract. So if you can perform, but it's just going to cost you more, these clauses aren't going to protect you. These clauses are intended for the things that are truly make it impossible to perform under the contract. When you're assessing your contract liabilities, I talked a little bit before, is it an ongoing contract or a supply contract? You also want to be thinking about how long does this contract go? And how do I get out of this contract if I need to? Some contracts may have provisions that say it lasts for, in general, for 3 years or 5 years, but it may also have a provision that says, notwithstanding that, either side can get out of this contract by giving 30 days written notice to the other side. Having an understanding of that before disaster is important so that you know if the worst case happens and I can't perform this, what do I need to do to limit the liability of the business going forward and get out of that obligation? The last thing is how do the contracts relate to each other? Most businesses have multiple contracts governing their business. I mentioned before you may have multiple packer contracts with different packers. You need to understand how those things relate to each other and make sure that those things make sense together so that you can perform both of those, so that you don't have obligations that end up contradicting each other in the event of a disaster. One last, even if your contract doesn't have a force majeure, there are legal doctrines out there that may provide protection in the event of a disaster. I'm not going to spend too much time on these here because these are truly the last line of defense if you're standing on the edge of a cliff after a disaster. These aren't things you want to be relying on when you're preparing. These are something's happened that we weren't expecting, and is there something we can do about it? After you assess your contracts, the next step is assessing your insurance coverage. Going through and understanding what coverage you have. These are going to be the protections that can protect your business going forward. And insurance policies are difficult, they're long, they're confusing. Even for lawyers who deal with insurance issues on an everyday basis, these contracts are difficult to wrap your head around. And I don't know why they do it this way. other than they have a lot of forms that they use repeatedly. And at one time, some case in the past came up and a court ruled one particular way on one particular situation. And the insurance companies say, okay, we're carving this out. And those policies just grow over time as that happens. But the one key aspect here is you have your coverage, you have your general policy. There are often a lot of conditions, exceptions, exclusions that get tacked on as separate pages or addenda to those policies. You can't ignore those. Those are going to be the things that the insurance company comes back afterwards and waives and says, aha, we don't have to pay you. So understand how those are going to apply, be aware of those, and make sure you're addressing those on the front end. The other thing to think about is who is covered by your policy. In many operations, there may be different entities. There may be a trust that owns the farm and a different business entity that is operating the business for either liability protection or estate planning measures. You may have multiple owners or multiple people who are involved in the operation. You need to understand who are the named insureds on the policy and make sure that when you're doing it, you have all of that covered so that you make sure the right entities are covered by your insurance. One thing that I want to note specifically that is kind of a hot topic right now in the law is pollution exclusions. I put the language up there from one particular policy that was litigated fairly recently. But these exclusions basically say, despite your general farming operation, if there is a release of pollutants, we, insurance company, don't have to provide coverage to you. And where these have come up is in the case of manure. And in particular, manure that is being land applied to fields as fertilizer. Does the policy cover if that manure either runs off or leaches through the ground and contaminates a neighboring well? That was the Wisconsin case that's referenced here. I'm referencing this case in particular because there was a great line from the Wisconsin Court of Appeals where they referred to manure as to a farmer as liquid gold. So I just love that line from the court case. Unfortunately, the Wisconsin Supreme Court went back and reversed that and said the pollution exclusion applies in that case, and there was no insurance coverage. Bear in mind, this was a farm policy that was marketed as a farm policy. The manure application equipment was identified as covered equipment on the policy. The barn was identified. Everyone knew that this was a farm and that they were taking manure, applying it to fields. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court said once it was applied to the field, it may have been fertilizer. But once it leached, that became a pollutant and the insurance company's off the hook. It makes no sense to me, but that's the law in the state of Wisconsin. Illinois reached a different outcome on a similar case and said there is coverage. There's not a lot of other case law out there. So Minnesota, Iowa, a lot of other states, we're left to guess right now. But the key takeaway is you can address the pollution exclusion when you're addressing your coverage. And the key with insurance generally is you get what you pay for. Sometimes you're going to pay more for coverage to get rid of a pollution exclusion. You may pay more for coverage from particular companies who are out there. But if you go for the lowest common denominator, for the cheapest policy you can find, you should expect that if you need to go and use that coverage, there's a reason it was cheap, and you're not going to get the same level of service as you would. And that can be really key. I've been involved with multiple disasters for multiple producers. There is a huge difference between those who are working with good companies who are out there, with local agents who know the farm and are doing a good job. Those processes are generally seamless. Others who are looking for the cheapest insurance, you're going to end up with a fight if you need to use that insurance. With your coverage, one other aspect to think about, what are you covering? And this is particular for your property coverage. Are you covering the market value, or are you covering the replacement cost? If you're talking about a 20-year-old barn that has a roof collapse, those numbers can be very different. So make sure you pay attention when you're going through your policy and know what you're paying for. Are you paying for the value of that building that was standing? Are you paying for the value of the building that you're going to have to build if that barn goes down? Another aspect, business interruption insurance. Is the policy going to cover profits that you lose due to the disruption of the farm? These are generally add-ons to insurance policies. They're not part of standard policies, but they're things you want to think about. The last thing I want to touch on, and this is kind of a segue to reporting obligations, is most policies require immediate reporting to the insurance companies. Cameron talked about the situation with the fire where within 24 hours you had all of these inspectors from around the country out there. This is why they want those immediate reports, is they want to figure out what happened while things are fresh, while the evidence is still there. And those are things that the insurance companies enforce strictly. So if your policy says you need to report immediately, you need to report immediately. And if your policy says that, you need to know about that ahead of time. Because I guarantee you, if you have a fire and you have a barn going and trying to deal with the pigs, the last thing that you're going to be thinking about is, gee, I should call the insurance company right now. That comes later, and it might be too late. Possibly the only people that you may think of calling later than the insurance company is the government. But this is another important one, and I will tell one anecdote that's not a disaster, but I think illustrates how this could apply. Several years ago, I was working with a co-op that sold anhydrous ammonia to crop farmers and had a number of the field tanks sitting out there. One night, a few of the best and the brightest in the community decided that they were going to break onto the property in the middle of the night and try to steal the anhydrous ammonia to make methamphetamine. And to do this, they were going to try to transfer it into some jerry-rigged fire extinguisher that they had emptied. This went badly. The entire tanks, and there was 4 of them, I believe, all of that anhydrous ammonia ended up being released into the air. Thankfully, no one was seriously injured. But next day, owner of the business shows up, sees the fire extinguisher sitting there and the empty tanks. They call the local sheriff. They come out with the hazmat gear and are responding. But they don't say, I think justifiably, you know what I should do right now? I should call the United States National Response Center out in Maryland and tell them that a few idiots broke onto my business and tried to steal my anhydrous ammonia. Well, the EPA came in and said, you violated federal law because you waited 5 hours after you discovered this before you called us out in Maryland. Not that we would have done anything with that information. It doesn't matter. And the EPA imposed a fairly significant fine on that business. That's why this is important. That's why you need to understand in advance, if a disaster occurs and there is a release of a substance, you have obligations to report this right away, as soon as you know about it. And there are 3 levels of reporting that are required under federal law. There's a call to the National Response Center, which again is run by the Coast Guard out in Maryland. There's a call to the state duty officer, and there's a call to local emergency response officials. All 3 of those calls are required under federal law. This isn't the reporting for the routine emissions of manure or air emissions from manure. Thankfully, that was addressed by Congress earlier this year. There was a chance that these laws were going to apply to those, but I will give Congress credit. It's the fastest I've ever seen them move after the court case came out on that. But this is the catastrophic. This is the unexpected release. If the anhydrous ammonia where you have an issue. If there's a feed mill that you're operating and there's some hazardous substance there. Those are the type of events you want to be thinking about. If a manure system fails, you need to be thinking about under your permits what you need to do. Again, just being aware of those. All of this leads to how do you prepare? You've identified your risks, you've gone through your contracts, you've gone through the insurance, your regulatory requirements. You need to put together a plan for each type of disaster. And it should be a written plan that you have at the site. And what I would recommend to everyone is that that plan should include, if this event happens, if there's a tornado, have a list of contact information and have somebody identified that they're the person that's going to do this. So-and-so is responsible for calling, making the calls to the federal government. This other person's responsible for calling the insurance company. Another person's responsible for having your vendors, and you should have these names and numbers in there. If you need to dispose of dead pigs, who are you going to call to do that? Have that thought about ahead of time so you have a list of numbers and a checklist that you can just go through and it's ready to go. What to do after? I'm going to skip this because we are short on time. Finally, wrapping up, another Benjamin Franklin quote. I like the beer one better. But if you fail to plan, you're planning to fail. Having that written plan ahead of time, thinking about these issues ahead of time will save you a lot of stress, save you a lot of turmoil in a time where you're already going to be going through tremendous stress. I've covered this. This is my plug. Our law firm does a dirt magazine. Our issue from last summer covers this topic, goes into a little bit more detail, including the slides I skipped over. You can go on our website. It's available for free. Take a look at that. Otherwise, I will be around for any questions as well.